right, thanks everyone for joining the backup and recovery office hours session. Today we're going to be talking about the zero data loss recovery appliance and a recent third-party compliance assessment that was completed that covers a lot of government regulations that are especially important for financial services organizations. So, why do people care about this assessment, and like, what is the importance of this assessment, and why did it come about? So, as we hear over and over and over again, malware and ransomware attacks are increasing, and they're very, very expensive. We're talking about, in a lot of cases, millions of dollars are spent with remediation processes. And it's costly monetarily like that. It's also costly from a business reputation, because now you have to tell all your customers that you had a data breach, and all the processes and procedures that go around that, alerting customers that their information may actually have been leaked out to the internet. Those are very uncomfortable conversations to have as a business. So we've got C-level and boards have been, really pressing action plans, and now the regulators are involved, and regulators are being, very strict about the compliance requirements for organizations. And this is especially critical for SEC regulatory compliance in financial services. So it's not a suggestion from the regulators anymore. It is becoming a demand. Like, if you don't have this regulatory compliance covered, there are ramifications for that, and the regulators are becoming more and more strict. So what we wanted to do, obviously, we had a third party come in and look at the recovery appliance. So Cohasset is the name of the organization that did this work for us. They're a leading professional consulting firm, and they specialize in this type of information governance as it's related to the SEC and governmental regulatory compliance. And they created this report. The link to the report's at the bottom. I'm going to highlight some of the areas of importance around the report, and how it applies to the recovery appliance, and how it applies to backup and recovery, because a lot of this is about retaining records and not allowing them to just get deleted and data disappearing. And the assessment report itself is about 38 pages. Obviously, they go into great detail about the regulation, the content of the regulation, and then how the recovery appliance meets that particular component of the regulation. For our purposes today, I'm going to focus on just the functional compliance requirements around SEC Rule 17A-4F. And a lot of the other rules make reference back to that. So if you look at the CFTC rule and the MiFID rule, those all make references back to the SEC rule. So they all kind of roll up together around these SEC rules that are defined. So take your time, read the paper. Obviously, that's available. We'll also post the link out on Ask Tom so that you can see it and retrieve it. It's on the external Oracle.com site, obviously. But let's get started, and we'll start with this concept of non-rewritable, non-erasable record format. And we commonly refer to that as immutability. And to accomplish this, there has to be some initial setup and configuration of the recovery appliance. And the paper goes into this. They talk from a high level about the processes that need to take place before the recovery appliance is ready for meeting these compliance requirements. And it's also in the documentation. So if you go in the documentation, I've got the links at the back. There's a whole quick start around this process, what you need to do to the recovery appliance to prepare it for meeting the regulatory compliance needs. So the first thing you have to do is you have to prepare your recovery appliance administrator users and also the OS users. So the appliance itself, obviously, like all appliances that exist in the world, they have an underlying OS. So there's an application layer and there's an OS layer. You have to create multiple users in those spaces. And the reason you have to create multiple users is because to elevate privileges, it takes multiple users to approve that. So if I, as an administrator, want to elevate my privileges inside the recovery appliance, either at the application level or the OS level, I have to get 2 other administrators to approve my elevation. So I can't just do it alone. I can't just say, hey, I want to become a super user on the machine. That's not allowed alone. I have to get 2 other people to approve my elevation of privileges. So in the end, it takes 3 people to be able to elevate privileges. The next thing, once you create the multiple users, that means everyone who's an administrator, either at the OS level or at the application level, have an individual login, and root is gone now. So we're disabling root access. We're disabling SSH access for both root and any default Oracle accounts, which means now any user that's interacting with the appliance has a login as themselves. And that's important because we don't want any generic accounts roaming around, right? If someone is going to log into the appliance, we want to know exactly who that person is, and we're keeping track of that in the appliance. So you can see people that when they log in as themselves, you can see exactly which activities they are performing and any attempts that they are making to do things that are outside their privileges. So if they make a request to become a super user, and they shouldn't be doing that, it's going to be logged. And then, of course, if one other administrator says no, it shuts down that request completely. But all of that activity is logged. Everything that they do inside the recovery appliance infrastructure is logged with that specific user account in mind. We're also disabling any super user accounts that are inside the application layer itself. So if you've used the recovery appliance in the past, there's a super user called RASys. And RASys is, kind of like the root user on the OS, and that's disabled as well. So no RASys user is allowed. No, the generic RASys user is not allowed to access the system, and we've also turned off the access for that user. Having a time service associated with the recovery appliance is also important because we're talking about maintaining backups over a period of time. And the time service is obviously important to do that. So you don't want the recovery appliance itself maintaining its own source of time. It must be configured to an external time source. That's done through RACLI. And there's also a check in RACLI that will ensure that all of the settings that are necessary to maintain compliance have been completed. So at the end of this process of the initial setup, you can check and say, okay, RACLI, tell me if all the settings have been completed in the recovery appliance and it's ready. If you're using remote object storage, the object storage has a concept of a locked retention rule, and that's something that should be configured as well. If you plan to use that, obviously the whole concept around not being able to delete or modify backups has to do with locking the modification, and the concept that does that for object storage is called a locked retention rule. I see in the Q&A there was a question about where is the audit log stored. So there are 2 different places for the application level users. So our recovery appliance administrator, there's a API log that's kept for the application level access and changes, and we'll keep track of all that. We call it an API report, or we call it an API. It's an API tracking system, and there's a report that can be run against that that shows all the API interfaces, who made an API request, either that direct through an API or through the the administration console. And then for OS users, everything gets pumped into the syslog. So anything at the OS level gets pushed into the syslog. So you'll see, access to the OS, who was the user, and what activity they performed or what they attempted to perform. So that's all in syslog. Okay. Moving on. So now let's step in. So the initial configuration is complete. You've done the check with RACLI. It says, yes, everything is configured. The system is ready to go. Now you have to start setting up the different components. So let's talk about, as I mentioned before, we're talking about non-rewritable, non-erasable record format. This is accomplished with the protection policy. So in the protection policy now, starting with the Recovery Appliance Software Release 21, which is where the assessment was done, there is the concept of recovery window compliance. And recovery window compliance is a setting in the protection policy itself, and it tells the recovery appliance that the window specified, nothing in that window can be modified, overwritten, or deleted. You also can't shorten that window. And so what I mean by that is, if a backup came in and the retention rule was set for 7 days, once that backup comes in, you can't go to the protection policy now and say, you know what, I want the protection policy to represent the recovery window compliance for 2 days. You can change the policy, but it does not take effect on the backups. The backups that were created under a policy retain the settings for the policy when the backups were created. So you can't shorten the retention rule. You would have to wait all 7 days for those backups to expire, and then the new rule would take effect with the new retention rule. Now, it does not prohibit you from expanding the recovery window compliance. So if you had it set for 7 days and then you moved it to 14 days, the recovery appliance would immediately say, okay, you want it to be 14 days now. I'm taking all the backups that are covered under this protection policy, and they now have a longer recovery window compliance. And now you can't shorten that. So now you've increased the window, you cannot back down. You have to wait for those new backups, those backups to expire before the window can be changed. This is the example of how you do this through the API. You'll see this new value, recovery window compliance, in the list. And then separate from that, if you're sending data off to object storage, you can set a separate keep until time on long-term retention backups. So your local backups have 7 days through the recovery window compliance. And now you can create an archival backup from the recovery appliance that represents a point in time that you specify, and it will be kept in object storage for the length of time that you've specified. So you can create longer-term retention that's stored in object storage outside of the protection policy that's in the recovery appliance. And of course, you want to set, as I mentioned in the beginning, you want to set your retention on the object storage so that it does not, so that the backups are kept for the same period of time. So you have to match those up. So that's also something to keep in mind, because remember, object storage is accessible outside the recovery appliance. So you don't want to get into a situation where you haven't set the retention properly on the object storage and someone connects directly up to the object storage outside a recovery appliance and manipulates your backups. You want to keep that, you want to set those retention policies on the object storage to make sure that they stay intact, and then set your retention policy appropriately when you create your archival backup. Okay, let's see. And we got some answers coming, Q&A happening on the side. If there's a particular question that comes up that I need to stop, one of the moderators, if you could pause me, I'll answer that live. Okay, so let's move onward. The other concept that comes into play with this non-rewritable, non-erasable record format is the concept of legal hold. And this means that, you saw your retention policy, you had the compliance retention set for 7 days. It could be whatever you want it to be. It could be 30 days, 45 days, 90 days, whatever you want it to be. But then legal comes along and legal says, hey, I need you to hold backups for a particular database until I tell you to stop. So the recovery appliance, of course, has the capability. You can go in and say, hey, this particular database, because we do this at the database level, so it doesn't require you to hold the backups for everything that's in the recovery appliance. You say, the legal contacted me. They said the finance database needs to be held starting 14 days ago, and I need to keep those in place. So you set the compliance hold, you tell the recovery appliance, you could put in an actual date here. And in this particular case, we're saying starting 14 days ago, everything that was created after that is on compliance hold. And that means that the recovery appliance will not delete anything inside the recovery appliance until the legal hold is removed for that database. So it retains backups until the hold is removed, and that means it's essentially overriding the policy. And let's say this hold lasted for 2 months, and then legal comes along and says, okay, the finance database can come out of legal hold now. We don't need that data anymore. So you turn off the hold. What essentially happens is now the policy takes over. So the policy that you had set previously now takes over and looks at the data and says, okay, this has been on hold for 2 months. The policy says I'm only supposed to keep it for 30 days. So all these backups that are older than 30 days, according to the policy, can now be cleaned up, and the policy will go and clean up the recovery appliance because the hold has been removed. And that takes us to this backup and deletion operation, right? Everything that's in the recovery appliance is going to be managed by the policy. So the DBA can't go in and override the policy via RMAN and run a delete command to get rid of backups. We're going to reject that. That's not going to happen. And the recovery appliance is going to just essentially use the policy. So it's going to say, okay, is the backup outside of the retention window that's defined in the policy? And if it is, it's eligible for deletion. And it's also going to check to make sure there's no legal hold active for the database that is specified. So if there's like I mentioned before, if there's a database in legal hold, that overrides the policy, and then the policy doesn't do the deletion. And legal holds are like, I refer to those as a transitive state, right? They get applied, they get removed, and then the policy is the ongoing state of the backups. Okay, so let's move onward. Okay, so that covers all of our immutable backup storage. Backups are being stored in the infrastructure. The policy is ensuring strict retention based on the compliance settings in the policy. And the recovery appliance is honoring that. The recovery appliance is not allowing anyone, even an administrator, to come in and manipulate those. The DBA can't send in a delete from RMAN. The recovery appliance administrator can't delete databases out of a policy. They can't delete backups. Everything, the system is retaining backups based on the policy settings for compliance. Okay, so now let's look at the next piece, which they call accurate recording process. So the accurate recording process essentially says you're storing, you're verifying automatically that the quality and accuracy of the storage media is being preserved during the recording process, which essentially for us means the backups that we are holding are actually good. So, and the recovery appliance is very good at this. It does an amazing job making sure that the backups that are stored on the recovery appliance are actually recoverable. And that's very important. A lot of backup solutions don't go through the links of all the processes that the recovery appliance goes through. So if we think about the workflow that I'm showing here, backups come into the recovery appliance. Every backup that arrives is automatically recovery. It goes through a recovery validation process, every single one of them. That's not a setting that someone chooses. That's not a process that the DBA has to kick off on their own. It happens automatically with every single backup that arrives. The other thing that happens is, if a customer has the requirement to have an offsite replica or a cyber vault location, which is represented by this recovery appliance up at the top, any backup that is leaving the recovery appliance and going to a remote replica, while it's leaving, it is also validated all over again, because we want to ensure that the data going out of the recovery appliance is validated and it is good for recovery. And the same thing applies to object storage. If the data is going out of the recovery appliance to object storage, the data is validated as it leaves the recovery appliance. We want to make sure that we're not sending bad data or unrecoverable data to another destination. Always doing validation. And that's through the movement process. The other thing that happens is, on a regular basis, the recovery appliance is processing backups that are older. So just because the backup is sitting there and not being used, or not being replicated, or not being sent to object storage, that's already happened. The backups are just living in the recovery appliance. We're still checking those things all the time. Are they good for recovery validation? Did something happen? Do we have all the pieces that are necessary to actually recover the database in the time window specified by the policy? And if any of those things have problems, the recovery appliance first tries to remediate that on its own. And if not, it starts issuing notifications so that the administrators can take the appropriate action. They can look at the backups to determine why exactly is there a problem with the data? Maybe someone didn't send the right RMAN command to send data into the recovery appliance. Maybe they were, backing up PDBs instead of the whole container. And now we recognize that, wait, there are pieces missing because not every PDB is covered in the container. So we're paying really close attention to, are all the pieces there? Are they all valid for recovery? And this is done at multiple levels. We do it at the backup block. We do it at the header that represents the backups. We do the backup piece validations. And we just make sure that all the pieces required for recovery of the database are present and they're good. And I talked about the replica earlier. Just because the data came from an existing recovery appliance and is going to a replica, the replica doesn't trust the fact that it just came from another recovery appliance. It goes through the validation process all over again. So it does all the same processes to the backups that are arriving, and it has this periodic process that runs as well. So if you're using a replica, now you've got two sources of validated backups, and they're validated and confirmed independently. And neither one of these appliances have to go back to the production database to do that. This is all an internally managed process that is done, as I mentioned, automatically every single time a backup is created. Okay. So let's move on from that and talk about the next concept, which is the original and duplicate units of storage media. So let's look at that as well. So this is the definition up in the corner, as we've been using all along. So serialize the original and, if applicable, duplicate units of storage media, and time and date for required period of retention the information placed on such storage media. So this just means that we have to uniquely identify all the media. So everything that comes in from the Oracle database as a backup into the recovery appliance has unique RMAN information that's wrapped around it. And that represents date and time information for the backup and for the database being protected, right? Because we're talking about backup windows. We're not talking about an individual point in time. A lot of people think about backups as a point in time. And it is a point in time, but typically people want, your database to be covered for a window. Like I need to be able to restore to any point in time over a 30-day window. So it's more than just an individual point in time. You have to look at everything cumulatively, and you have to be able to uniquely identify all the information that's stored in that cumulative window. And the recovery appliance does that. It uses the RMAN information that is created with each backup piece, and we store that along with the backups themselves, and they live for the length of the duration that's defined in the policy. So the two pieces live together, right? You've got the identifier information that describes all the backups, and then you have the actual backup payloads themselves, and they are retained for the duration of the policy. When stuff is sent off to object storage, there's a unique E-tag identifier that's associated with the storage that ensures that the objects stored in OCI and the object storage can be uniquely identified by this E-tag, and that is what keeps the data all together. You have to be able to leverage the metadata to describe and report on information that's stored for your backups, because the backups themselves are interesting, but you need all that wrapped unique information to make sure that you're covered. Okay. The next is the capacity to download indexes and records. So this means, in the last section, we talked about all this unique information that's stored that represents, that describes the backup pieces. This is the capability of reporting on that unique information. So RMAN has, a list command that will show all this metadata. So if you do RMAN list backups, you can see all the information that's associated with the database, all the metadata that we keep track of that is retained for the length of time that's identified in the policy or specified in the policy. And then RMAN obviously can retrieve the records, and that's essentially a recovery of any of the backup pieces that exist in any location. So, RMAN connects up to the recovery appliance, and the recovery appliance knows about all the pieces that exist in all these different locations. And that metadata that's in there allows RMAN to retrieve the data. So if someone says, I want to retrieve data that's in the last, if we think back about our retention window, right? We had 30 days on this central recovery appliance, and then we created backups that were held for a year over in object storage based on our copy process, our archival process. So if RMAN says, I need a backup that was from June 1st, obviously that data exists in this center recovery appliance. You can issue the RMAN recovery process, or you can use an RMAN recovery command. That process will retrieve the data out of the central recovery appliance. If you say, hey, I want data that represents a backup from January. Well, that was 6 months ago. There's only 30 days here, but your object storage location has data for the past year. Okay, so now when the request comes in from RMAN, the recovery appliance knows that this data is over in object storage, and it is sent back to RMAN because it's retained for a year. So RMAN has the capabilities to do the recovery of the backup copies that exist in the infrastructure. And we have the rich metadata wrapped around that, so users who are looking for data can see that, and then they can issue the command to, and RMAN will retrieve it. And all this happens automatically. Okay, next is a duplicate copy of records will be stored separately. So let's talk about that. So we're going back to this, process where there are multiple recovery appliance and object storage, because depending on your organization's requirements, right? This recovery appliance in the center keeps multiple copies of data. There's not, the recovery appliance architecture itself is redundant in many, many ways. And one of the pieces of redundancy is we store the backup data in multiple storage servers. It's a mirror. So the data doesn't exist in just one copy. It actually exists in multiple copies inside of the recovery appliance. There's 2 copies all the time inside the recovery appliance itself. Now, if your organization says, I also have to retain a remote replica in another data center for DR purposes, obviously the data that's replicated from one recovery appliance to another recovery appliance in a remote location or in the cyber vault, that will also contain 2 copies, because if you're in a DR situation and your primary data center goes down and you're having to fail over to an alternate location, you still want to have duplicate copies of the record to satisfy SEC regulations. So you've got 2 copies here, you've got 2 copies in your DR site. If your primary goes down, you still have the 2 copies in your DR site that are ready to go. So you're covered in both scenarios. Production's down and you need to go to the DR site. And obviously for long-term retention, you can also store data in object storage, and the object storage itself also stores multiple copies in Oracle Cloud. So if one availability domain is down, for example, there will be a copy of the data in another availability domain. So we're always storing multiple copies, and that satisfies this duplicate records requirement in the SEC requirement. Okay, so let's move onward. Okay, so we've gone through all the requirements, and just as a recap, so let's just sum it all up. So I'm going to match the recovery appliance feature to the requirement from the SEC rules. The first, non-rewritable, non-erasable record format. The recovery appliance has this concept of immutable backup, and that is controlled by your policy and your compliance settings in the policy. So your recovery window compliance is going to define the period of your backup immutability. From an accurate record process, every backup that comes into the recovery appliance is validated for recovery. That is a unique process that the recovery appliance does. It does it, as I mentioned before, it does it automatically every single time. There's no process that the DBA has to go and instantiate or perform. It doesn't, it's not something that a DBA would do like once a week. It happens every single time that a backup arrives. Recovery validation happens. And it happens in a self-contained way to the recovery appliance. So we're not going back to the production server and requiring the production server to do something. This is all automatic, self-contained in the recovery appliance. Oops. Serialize the original and duplicate units of storage media. I talked about the unique identifiers that are retained with the backup. So the backup and the unique identifiers, which is stored in the metadata, those all get retained together according to the immutable policy mentioned at the beginning. The capacity to download indexes and records. The indexes themselves are part of the RMAN list. That's the metadata that comes back that describes all the backups. The records are the backup, and RMAN recovery retrieves those backups. So the 2 are related together because one describes the backups, but if you actually needed to retrieve the backups, it's done through RMAN recovery. Duplicate copies. Each recovery appliance has a self-healing duplicate copy of data, and that data, as I mentioned before, is validated all the time. And then the Oracle Cloud Object Storage also has duplicate copies. So there are duplicate copies everywhere in the infrastructure. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is, we're talking about compliance, we're talking about this assessment and how it protects, immutable backups and how you follow the regulations. But one thing, one thing I want to stress is there's not a single silver bullet for cybersecurity. Everybody always looks for that, right? And following the SEC guidelines is a piece of, meeting regulatory requirements and making sure that bad things don't happen if you have an intrusion from a cyber criminal. But you have to remember, they only have to find one hole in your infrastructure. So make sure you have a holistic approach. Make sure access control is correct. I talked in the beginning about having multiple accounts. Make sure that those accounts are unique across your infrastructure. I don't know how many times I run across customers that use they have a DBA, and that DBA has accounts on every single database in their infrastructure, and it's the same username and password. That is bad, 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 because that means if one user account is compromised, now the cyber criminal has access all over the place. So having unique accounts and unique passwords is important. And also make sure it's role appropriate. Every person doesn't need to be a DBA. Backups do not need to be sysdba. There is a role in the database specifically for backup and recovery. Make sure the accounts you're using for backup and recovery aren't sysdba accounts. Make sure that they are specific to the role of backup. So keep that in mind. Don't just let sysdba accounts roam all over your network, and make sure they're unique. Make sure you have a policy framework and auditing. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure patches are occurring regularly. A lot of the cyber attacks that we hear about is due to a patch that came out a year previously. These cyber criminals know the vulnerabilities that exist in systems. They are looking for these vulnerabilities, and when a patch comes out, that cues them into the fact that there is a hole that they can go and try to use for infiltration. So make sure you have regular patching. Make sure you are consistent with your protection. One of the other things that we find quite regularly when we're working with customers to do backup and recovery implementation, they query all their databases and they realize, oh, there's a completely inconsistent framework for how long database backups are retained. Some of them are retained for an incredibly short period of time, which they didn't expect. Some of them are retained too long. Some of them are retained not at all, or backups didn't happen. So please be consistent and make sure that you're auditing the fact that backups are happening on a regular basis. The Recovery Appliance has a rich reporting infrastructure that will show you this information. So please leverage that. Make sure you do regular validation. And not just, hey, the backups ran, that's my validation. You want to make sure that you understand recoverability and revisit your SLAs. Databases that are introduced to your infrastructure may change in criticality over their lifespan. So the protection policies that you put in place on day one may not apply a year later. You really need to pay attention to your SLAs as they are associated to those databases, because databases have a tendency to become more critical over time. And if you think, on day one, what looked like, okay, I can recover this database in 3 days or 5 days because it's a brand new database. Now that SLA may need to be 2 hours. And you need to understand that and make sure that you have your processes in place to handle that. And finally, have a recovery plan. It's different than DR. People talk about DR all the time and prepare for DR, but when you talk about a cyber security intrusion where you don't know what has been compromised and what has been compromised, you want to make sure that you understand how to reset the systems and go from scratch. You want to make sure you have a clean location. You want to have a detailed run book that describes all this. What are your new network paths going to look like because you have a compromise and someone is running afoul in your network? So make sure that you have those run books in place. Don't let it be on the job training in the middle of the night for people that are trying to get these systems back online so your business can continue. And then finally, practice, 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 practice. Because if you don't practice, you don't realize if there's a piece missing. And that is not a good thing to discover during an infiltration. Okay, so as I say, make sure you have a holistic approach. Look at everything. The cyber criminals only need to find one missing piece in your whole infrastructure. You have to try to be as perfect as possible all the time. So please, please, please try to make sure all your bases are covered. And we've done some. If you look back in the backup and recovery office hours, we've done several sessions on cybersecurity. Go back and review those. And look at the technologies that are available to you that protect the Oracle database and make sure that you're covered. This is the list of resources. Again, the link to the compliance report itself, and then some links to the recovery appliance, customers that have used the recovery appliance. We have a cybersecurity architecture that is interesting, and you would definitely want to take a look at that. If you haven't thought about a cyber vault architecture in the past and you want to kind of up your game, if you will, in your protection of and your preparation for a cyber vault or cyber attack, I've got a link to the object storage retention rules so you can understand exactly how that works if you're using object storage today. These are important rules. Like, think about how you want data to be retained in object storage if you're using object storage. And this is the link to how all the rules work. And those are very beneficial because the object storage is accessible from anywhere, not just from the recovery appliance, but actually from anywhere. And as I mentioned before, there's a compliance quick start for the recovery appliance. This is the link to that documentation. It will describe all the things that are necessary to get you started. It'll describe the processes to get your user set up, to get all the external access to lock down, and it'll prepare the recovery appliance. It gives you all the commands to do that. That is the end of the presentation today. I know we've got about 15 minutes. I'll look over and see if there's anything in the QA. Any of the other moderators, if there's something that you would, if there's something I should cover, please let me know and I'll cover those questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, for that. There are 2 questions that are still open. They just filed. If you want to take a quick look at those.
Okay, so the first one's about training.
Right.
So is there a virtual environment to train with recovery appliance? There's not a virtual environment, but there are internal resources that can be leveraged. So as a customer, you can talk to your sales folks. The sales folks have access to internal environments where they can demonstrate and give you some hands-on experience with the recovery appliance. Those are done through our solution center. So that is available. Let's see. The next one is when we create custom RADB users, they don't have the same privileges as RAs. Is there a way to provide additional access for those custom DB users? Is there a way to provide? Okay, so we probably need to take that offline. When you create users for recovery appliance administration, they have all the privileges that are necessary for administration. They do not have the same privileges as RA-Sys because RA-Sys is allowed to arbitrarily delete stuff, which is not allowed. But the RA admin users, for example, have all the privileges necessary to administer the system. So if there is additional access that you think that user needs, we need to look at that because there should not be any additional access required by the RA administrators that are created. So See, I don't see they don't have API access privileges. They do have API access privileges. So we need to look at that and see what you're running into. All the APIs are available for the RA administrators. They cannot, as I mentioned, delete data, but they can query all the APIs. So let's take a look at that in detail. Okay. Any other questions? Pop them into the Q&A. I don't see any other questions. All right, there are no other questions. We'll close the session off today. I really appreciate your time. The recording will be posted over the next couple of days in the Ask Tom site, so you can go back and review those questions. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.